So to finish up this unit, I want to say a little bit about conscientious objection. I'm not going to go into great detail here. It's a really contentious topic. It's interesting, but it's the guidelines are a bit less clear here, but I do think we should say a little bit about it. So how does conscientious objection differ from civil disobedience? Well, in a couple ways. Remember I said civil disobedience, when people engage in it, they want to change some public policy, and also most definitions of civil disobedience, people would say they are appealing to values, to a sense of justice that's widely shared by the public, right? You know, think of what Dr. King's doing. He thinks that, Southerners and other Americans share the same sense of justice that he has. They're just not applying it in the right way. They're making exceptions. They're in a sense being hypocritical. Now, someone who goes for conscientious objection doesn't necessarily aim to have the law changed. And he probably does not expect that the public will share his moral values. He's not appealing to a sort of public sense of justice. He is appealing to his own moral values. And he's not saying, well, I'm doing this to change public policy. He or she is saying it would be unfair, it would be wrong to make me do this because my conscience says it's wrong. I don't expect you to agree with me. I don't expect you to change the law because I'm doing this, but it would be wrong to make me follow this particular law because my conscience says that it would be wrong for me to do it. So probably the textbook case of conscientious objection, and the one that we all think of when we hear the word, I'm guessing, are people who refuse the draft on the grounds that they think war is morally wrong, right? There might be blurrier cases, people who aren't pacifists, who refuse to be drafted in a particular war because they think that war is unjust. That was some of the people in the Vietnam War. Conscientious objection, on the other hand, is someone who says, I think war, full stop, is always wrong. The line between conscientious objection and civil disobedience can be a bit blurry, but I do think there's a real line here. But it's not limited to, cases of people refusing to serve in wars, right? I mean, conscientious objection gets tied up with these issues of religious liberty. It comes up a lot in contemporary debates, Catholic hospitals not wanting to follow some of the dictates of Obamacare because they say to provide contraception, or Catholic employers, they say to provide contraception would violate their religious tenets. Same with, Hobby Lobby also objecting to some of the things that Obamacare would say they have to provide, right? Again, they say it violates their religious tenets. Other cases, another one that kind of gets into these issues of conscience, Yoder v. Wisconsin, the Amish and Old Order Mennonites, they didn't want to send their kids to school beyond the 8th grade. Wisconsin tried to make them. They said that they should be allowed an exception for conscience. Eventually, the court sided with them. Other things coming in religion, the exceptions the government makes for some Native American churches to use drugs that are otherwise outlawed in their ceremonies, right? Okay, so this is a huge and vexed issue, so I'm not going to say a lot about it, but why should we respect appeals to conscience? And how far should we go with respecting appeals to conscience? Well, we'll have a few things to say. So why respect appeals to conscience? And here I'm following James Childress. I think he gives a very good account of what conscience is and why we should respect appeals to conscience in his paper, well, Appeals to Conscience. I'm not having you guys read the Childress paper because it's very long. He makes some good points. Also, sadly, philosophers do this a lot. He takes a very long time to make his good points. It's about 30 pages. I think it could easily be more like 15. I'm sure you're not going to object too strongly to less reading, right? But so Childress, there's a puzzle here, right? When people make these appeals to conscience, they're not appealing to public values, so we might very well disagree with them. They don't expect us to share them, and we might think they're dead wrong. And if we do think they're dead wrong, why in the world should we respect an appeal to conscience? Think about World War II, right? The pacifist says, no war is ever just. We'll talk about pacifism. We'll talk about just war theory later in the semester. I'm not going to serve in World War II. Well, I think practically all of us would say some wars are just. Sometimes it's acceptable to use violence, and World War II is a case where it's pretty acceptable to use violence. So we almost certainly don't share the conscientious objector's judgment, unlike a case of civil disobedience, so why should we allow him any sort of exception? All right, so I think there are two reasons. And the reasons that Childress gives, which I think are good ones, both relate back to this idea that being forced to violate our conscience is a great harm. Even if we think someone is wrong, we can admit that forcing him to act contrary to his conscience does a great harm to him. And if doing that, if forcing him to act contrary to his conscience would have a great harm, well, then we can also say that the state better have a darn good reason to make him violate his conscience, or to in effect pose this choice of you violate your conscience or we punish you. Either you do this thing that's going to harm you or we send you to jail or do whatever. And so Childress points out that conscience, violating our conscience harms us in two ways. One, if you violate your conscience, if you act in a way that you think is wrong, your conscience can punish you. In fact, if your conscience is developed, it does punish you. And we can see this, even if we don't share someone's commitments, we can see how it would be a great harm for them to violate their conscience, how they would feel guilty about it, how it would cause them psychological pain. Well, the second reason, and this kind of relates back to the first one, but if you violate your conscience, it's not just that you feel guilty, it's not just that you feel pain, it can really destroy your sense of who you are, your moral commitments, the values that you follow. They, in a sense, define who you are as a person, right? Take someone who's a pacifist, maybe someone who's a pacifist for religious reasons. Mennonites, Amish traditionally are pacifists. To violate these norms, to violate the norm of pacifism, to use violence would really destroy this person's sense of who they are as a person. Not just that they would feel guilty, in a sense, they wouldn't even be the person they take themselves to be anymore. Okay, so these are the reasons we should respect appeals to conscience, even if we don't agree with the person's appeal to conscience. Or they're the reasons Childress gives, and I think, Childress has given a very good account. All right then, so how far do we go with appeals to conscience? Obviously, we can't just accept any appeal to conscientious refusal, conscientious objection, and say, oh, you don't need to follow the law, right? I'll give you guys an example. Some of my relatives are actually Mennonites, that's why I keep falling back on the Mennonite example. And, one of the examples, I remember they signed us up for this religious newsletter for a while. And one of the examples that this newsletter was touting as, an appeal to conscience, as really exemplary behavior, were some Mennonites who own their own business. who went so far as to say, well, not just that I couldn't fight in a war, but supporting any sort of military would violate my conscience. So what these people had done is they figured out exactly how much of their taxes would go to defense, and they subtracted that, and they would only pay whatever percentage they thought didn't go to defense. Now, on the one hand, I definitely admire this level of conviction, this level of determination. On the other, it's pretty clear we can't let people get away with that, right? We can't let people decide what they're going to pay in their taxes and not going to pay in their taxes as an appeal to conscience. On the other side, I mean, I think it's pretty clear that it would be very wrong to make someone who is legitimately a pacifist serve in war. Okay, so how do we draw the distinction between these two clear cases? We don't want people to just make a sort of, I agree with X percent of what the government does, so I'll pay X percent in taxes, which is going too far, with legitimate appeals to conscience, with something like, well, I don't want to serve in a war, I think that's wrong, don't make me serve, don't draft me. Well, I think there are a few different tests we can look at when we evaluate whether we should respect appeals to conscience, whether we should really let someone out of what the law says, whether we should make an exception or not. So I'll talk about those, and then we'll finish this section on the duty to obey the law. So some considerations in evaluating appeals to conscience. How hard is it for the person to avoid the action that violates the law in question? So the idea here is, well, the law says do certain things. How hard would it be for the person to avoid that action? If the law comes in and says, well, your numbers come up, we're going to draft you, you have to go off and fight, it's pretty much impossible for that person to avoid it, right? But if the law says something like, well, if you enter a certain profession, the law says you have to do these certain things, well, it would be easier for the person to avoid it. They just don't enter that profession, right? So again, how hard is it for the person to avoid the action? That's part of how much latitude we're going to give the appeal to conscience. If someone says, well, I'm a police officer, but I don't believe in the use of force, you should allow me to be a police officer even though I will never ever use force. It would violate my conscience to ever use force, so don't put me in a situation where I have to. I think we'd say it's pretty easy for you to avoid that. Don't become a police officer, right? Second, how important is the government's interest here? What is the reason that the government has the law? If the government's interest, isn't very important, if it wouldn't do that much damage to, if what the government, is put in place, if it's not that important, then I think we're much more ready to allow an appeal to conscience, right? Take the case of Yoder v. Wisconsin. Educating children past the 8th grade, it's pretty important. It's not like the government's interest here that the world is going to fall apart if we allow these people to take their children out of school earlier. Finally, how much would allowing this exception undermine that interest? Take the case of conscientious objection during wartime. We allow certain people to do alternate service. Does that really undermine our ability to fight a war to defend ourselves? I mean, no, it doesn't. We allow certain Native American tribes an exception for very specific drugs for their religious ceremonies. Does that undermine the interest the government has in making drugs illegal generally? No, it doesn't. Contrast that with say people who refuse to pay their taxes because they think a certain percentage goes to, war, they don't like war. Well, the government's interest here, being able to defend us, very legitimate. How much would it undermine that interest if we just let any person who doesn't like spending money on war out of paying whatever percentage of your taxes go to that? It would completely undermine it, right? So I think, not going to get too deeply into this. It is a very contentious issue. Goodness, there's a lot written about it. But I think these guidelines, these 3 guidelines, give us some idea of when we should maybe allow an appeal to conscience and when appeals to conscience maybe, even if we sympathize with the person, we shouldn't allow them, right? It is painful for them to have to violate their conscience or be punished. But if the government's interest is compelling enough, if it's important enough, and if, allowing the exception would do enough damage to that interest, then the person might, sadly enough, we might have to make a decision. They will have to violate their conscience or be punished. And of course, when it's easy for them to avoid the action that violates the law by not entering in certain professions or by not putting themselves in certain situations, then I think we would say, well, the appeal to conscience has a lot less weight. The person can avoid the harm that, violating their conscience would do. Okay, so I know that last bit going through appeals to conscience went rather quickly. Just feel it was necessary to finish up the unit. Okay, so that's basically what I wanted to say about the, duty to obey the law. Next section, we'll be moving on to what sorts of restrictions the government can put on our behavior and why. Closely related question, kind of builds off the stuff in this unit. All right, so make sure you finish the assignments for this unit before moving on to that, and pretty soon we'll start with the interesting issue of what kinds of restrictions can the government put on our behavior by focusing on drug laws.